that first session was absolutely wonderful. I love all these approaches and ideas, and there's absolutely no way I can summarize everything in just a few words. But I mean, so much to think about, and so many important points on how we approach the world. I think we can see, the presented so much the challenges and definitely the opportunities. And I think just playing off of what was being wrapped up last time, especially looking at the importance of interdisciplinarity and bringing forward our approaches and our toolkits to work with hard sciences people who might not realize what broad toolkits are available. But with this, we don't need to hear any more from me. I will hand things over to the dulcet tones of Ayonghe to jump into your questions out there. So Ayonghe, take it away.
Thank you very much, Chris. So the first question: if COVID-19 pandemic has posed challenges and or opportunities for development research, how are these distributed among differently positioned scholars? For instance, those with a permanent position, grant holders, or those at different phases of their academic career. So perhaps I'll go by alphabetical order, if that's okay by the panelists. Maybe we start with Barry Gills.
No. Well, this calls for critique of academia and its hierarchy, I suppose. Well, it's a difficult thing to think about, or knowing what to suggest. I mean, I think, people, my view has always been, for some decades now, that when you find that maybe those at the top of the hierarchy are gatekeepers, and there's a certain orthodoxy or a set of criteria and expectations for getting your research application approved or getting your piece, your article published and so on, that I'm in favor of taking initiative and being proactive yourself and working collegially and cooperatively, forming teams, and then finding a way to create a space. And that includes in networks, of course, and meetings, or even organizations, and founding new organizations and subsections within existing organizations, doing things that are new outside of the box, but also outside of the established power hierarchy. And then as much as you can do, I know that's not so easy and is difficult, but it is possible. I'll just say personally that when I first started out in Britain in international relations, there was a group of dons, very senior, very powerful professors on both sides of the Atlantic who put down a kind of conservatism on the field of international relations and international political economy, which I had my training. And so instead of just kowtowing to them and doing what they wanted and writing what they wanted and following their rules, some of us just thought right away at the beginning, say, well, we're not going to do that. And we're going to make up our own rules, and we're going to create our own vehicles. We're going to found our own circle, our own association, our own journals. We're going to do it our way. So I would encourage you all to do that and to say, yes, that is possible. It won't be possible if you don't try, but you'll be surprised what might be possible if you do.
Thank you very much, Barry. I'll give the virtual floor to Bonn to comment on the question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think viewing this perspective, we must be very clear about our own positionality. So I look at this issue as as you know, as an immigrant researcher from the global south, pursuing a career in the global north, and we really see the the differences in the way resources and privileges are distributed. I think this pandemic should also make us realize how resources, access, and privileges are distributed. Um, and sometimes when in our classes in development studies, when we teach our students about development theory, we usually start with a reminder, and that is a discussion on Eurocentrism. Yeah, and 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 I've been based in this part of the world for like yeah, at least 12 years now. And what I notice is that even critical scholars in development studies are not realizing that they are also having their Eurocentric perspective. So Eurocentrism has different sources. It can be based on socialization. It can also be deliberate. Uh, but what I'm intrigued about is that Eurocentrism can also be subliminal, something in the subconscious. I cannot articulate it, but then somehow I feel it coming from the global south. Of course, if I can articulate it, it doesn't mean it's subconscious or subliminal anymore. Um, but that's just my realization. But the good thing about our field is that we have the cognizant, knowledge. I mean, we recognize these challenges. But I think it's just about being mindful on, as I mentioned, how resources are distributed in different positions and positionalities. So yeah, it's of course I view these issues from a precarious point of view, a person of color and all those things. So that's my own biases. I'm mindful of that. And I think as critical scholars, we always check ourselves whether we are imposing our own values over the other. So yeah, maybe I think other colleagues are in a much better position to articulate how our resources distributed at the moment and what can be done.
Thank you very much, Bonn. I will give the better floor to Elina to comment on the question. Is Elina there?
Yeah, enormous, very important question. Hard to answer very briefly. I think there are like groups of people who are really, there are means to do something about this and we don't. So we should maybe really think about, for example, the PhD students who do not have Finnish passports and their time is running out, so they lose residence permits. And if there's like difficulties doing field work, this is a group that is super vulnerable and have really like enormous difficulties in knowing how their lives will look like in a few years' time. And this is a group that the universities should work better on in terms of the migration officials. So there's a group with us now that really is hampered in a serious way. Another group I would think is the PhD students not being allowed healthcare in our system. So you can go to the terveyskeskus, but you're not allowed occupational healthcare nor the student services. And in terms of health crisis now and mental health problems among the very anxious students and PhD students, I think this is an issue that really should be talked about. How come we have a situation where a PhD student has really no means of discussing anxiety and mental health issues with supervisors who are then potentially employers and all that. It is a real thing. So we have a few issues that we could do better, but we turn a blind eye. But then for the rest, I think we could also try to think non-hierarchically in so many ways, and that might help, because in terms of an enormous crisis and urgency and catastrophe, the career anxieties are sometimes overshadowing the possibility of trying to think about one as an important player in the world, regardless of whether it's more like an activist-oriented academic self-image one has, or a more analytic. I think the analytical work is really important right now in terms of trying to understand how power operates in knowledge production right now. So even for those who are like, oh, it's seen as apolitical to do feminist Deleuzian, Foucauldian analytical work, I think it is important. And I think there is a way of seeing that in the face of a huge crisis, this work is so much more important than my own career prospect. So I can maybe find some kind of alliances and collegiality and right to exist in this world beyond my the neoliberal academia that is cruel. But yeah, it's hard times, but harder for some than others.
Thank you, Elina. Absolutely, I can totally agree with this. There has been quite a lot of difficulties for some of us researchers who have to be doing field work elsewhere in the world, and we are not able to do that anymore. So there is this sort of possibility for our research interest to be in a way shaped in such that it fits rather into this whole digital environment and way of doing things and gathering data, which otherwise might be different than having this sort of direct contact with people in the field. But I will give the federal floor to Tiina to perhaps give a comment on that question.
Okay, thank you. As I said already in my previous comment, obviously the challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemic are not distributed equally between different, researchers in different career stages, and it is very clear that of course the crisis has hit mostly those in the very first day, the starting stages, like PhD students who would desperately need the fieldwork, need the research visit, and so on and so forth, not only for the kind of competition, but the actual knowledge production for their thesis. And as Elina said, this is especially hard for those who are not Finnish or who have no European passport, but still are doing their research in our universities, which has really challenging implications for the people who had possibilities kind of to come from the global south as a PhD student or as a postdoc, but not now hampered. These possibilities are hampered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Time is running and the funds are not used, and so on and so forth. And I would like to also say that it's also a gender question to some extent, that even among the very privileged Finnish scholars, it is the question of who has the main responsibility of taking care of the homeschooling of the children and the other care responsibilities, and who has the possibility to focus on research, notwithstanding on what career stage you actually are. So I think this is very important thing also to keep in mind. What can be done? A lot has been said, but I think that for us who now are kind of in this privileged position that 1 year is not a disaster in our career. The only thing that we need to discuss with the, for example, with the funder of a project about alternative use of the funds and so on and so forth. So this is a small hassle, but nothing very serious. But I think for us, we need to be, we need to have the patience and the empathy and to kind of perseverance to use the kind of power we already have in order to to make it a little bit better for those who are hit first with the pandemic, by trying to find the alternatives, trying to find alternative funding, trying to be at least supportive if we can.
Thank you, Tiina. I think we should also give a bit of give the floor to anybody who might have a comment on that question in the panelists. Otherwise, we go to the second question. So there have been many issues and problems that have emerged or re-emerged during the pandemic era. But let's think of more specific to the Finnish society and Finnish research as a whole. What are some of those aspects that have long been missing out, but we haven't paid that much attention to? Should we start with Barry?
Oh, I think I would defer to. I think maybe Elina has probably better perspective on some of this than I. That's all right. I'd rather hear her first rather than.
What was the question? And maybe I think audience reactions would be interesting.
Yes. The question is about the different problems and issues that have emerged during the COVID pandemic, which more specific to the Finnish society and Finnish research as a whole, what we have been missing out, which we should give more attention to. So that's the question.
I also need to think, so maybe someone else.
Yeah,
Okay.
Tiina would like to say something.
Tiina would like to say something. Maybe Tiina first and then Bonn after.
Okay, so just maybe on basis of our own experience in our research project, and which is of course part of the Finnish development research at the moment, where we are researching citizenship and the safe citizen relationship in Uganda and Tanzania. Something, okay, well, this is that has re-emerged, not as a new thing, but kind of re-emerged, is the kind of the dynamics between authoritarian state and citizens, and how we can make sense out of that, because in both of our, case countries, Uganda and Tanzania, the COVID-19 has been politicized in very different ways, in kind of silencing the opposition and kind of hindering the opposition for campaigning for the elections, or as in Tanzanian case, silencing the whole citizenship to speak about COVID-19 at all. So this COVID-19 crisis has kind of re-revealed the kind of problematics in authoritarian governance, and the kind of how again COVID-19 functions as a way of restricting the civic space and the kind of free speech and freedom of association, which we need to kind of, as a development researchers, when we want people to be the kind of the source of the change, we need to understand that what are these contextual circumstances that people actually are located, and how they are restricted to even, for example, to speak about COVID-19.
I did think of something I could say now, which is that, for example, as has been there for a very long time and is re-emerged. I mean, despite the pandemic, we still have the ongoing crises of ecological crisis and what it does to people on the ground in so many parts of the world. So, as I mentioned, some of us are involved with EXALT, or the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives Initiative. And then there, I mean, Finnish corporations, forestry corporations, paper corporations, mining corporations, I mean, these are global actors. And there hasn't really been all that much research about the impacts they have on the communities where they work, and abuses that might be taking place, their contribution to the destructive elements of these crises, and including human rights abuses in some cases, as with many other corporations involved in extractivism around the world. So I mean, that I think has been under-researched and not given enough credence. I mean, as often is the case, there are vested interests who don't want this to be spoken about, and especially in the public sphere of discourse. It's in a way, taboo. We don't want to hear that. but it needs to be researched and it needs to be discussed and heard, and changes and reforms to their practices, transnational corporations' practices, Finnish transnational corporations, need to occur.
Yeah, I think as development researchers, we have all these moments that what we say, we told you so. As what Barry has been saying, that we anticipated this. We've been writing about all these inequalities and all this for a long, long time. But I think what we should realize is, as I mentioned in my opening, it's the rediscovery of studying capitalism. I mean, the different forms that it has taken and how capitalism is evolving. And that would entail a critique of mainstream development policy. For instance, if you look at the discourse now of global governance institutions, when they talk about feminism, it's welcome to us, feminism is good economics, gender equality is smart economics, health, we don't anymore problematize universal health coverage. Okay, World Bank is now okay with universal health coverage. But then we ask the question, what for? Because we need healthy individuals, healthy girls to be educated and highly skilled. But what's the agenda? What is the telos of that? And we are missing the perspective. What is important in global capitalism is the creation of a global proletariat, So the creation of the proletariat actually necessitates what I mentioned about, the culture of free competition. Yeah, so that so empowered women, can just be part of the labor force, to be subjected to the discipline of the labor market. Healthy individuals, they don't problematize that anymore. So we now have a lot of social variables that are dear to us in social sciences, gender, health, ethnicity, family, communities, citizenship, all uh, all gathered together, but within part of the circuit of capitalism. So we have to be very critical about how capitalism has manifested in different forms and how it has also accommodated and appropriated our own so-called progressive terminologies.
Thank you very much, Bonn. I'll be curious to hear from the audience. Does someone else have a comment on the question?
I can say, but if there are good questions from the audience, I would like to bring up two things, but they actually came up in a way. One is this parochialism of academia in Finland, and somehow it's been so clear due to the epidemic that there is so much we could do to mainstream development studies, thinking in other scholarly disciplines, in understanding how to think about these issues globally and how to avoid this kind of super colonial thinking about the rest of the world. And it also was very apparent in the government Africa strategy and the different universities global strategy discussions, that there is this aspirational whiteness and westernness, and not like thinking about how the alliances with global south would actually make us more relevant in the world. So that, like, trying to do the work of changing our general thinking is still a huge effort that we could do more in. And then also the issue of microbes and thinking differently around coexistence is so clearly now something that we could do. And this has to do with the COVID-19, but also with antibiotic resistance and other ways of rethinking health, hygiene, biomedicine.
Thank you, Elina. There is a question, a related question from the audience about the sustainable development goals and the foundation of economic growth. The perspective here is that those goals have often been sort of like analyzed as unsustainable in the sense. And the question is, the Finnish universities, the Finnish academy, the Finnish government continues to embrace the sustainable development goals. How should then development studies in Finland respond to these COVID times? Would you have a say on this, Elina?
I mean, I think I have a very like naive and optimistic version that I would like the others to take down. But in my view, there was a serious effort in developing the SDGs to try to bring together two fields that seldom interacted. The kind of development for human well-being part, where we are often involved in, even in its skeptical terms, there still was the human well-being must be on agenda, and then the environmental issues. And in some ways, the SDGs did try to do some efforts in trying to change the mindset, for example, by making challenging the idea of growth in the global north. Well, of course, it didn't quite work, but I mean, if this meeting of two very different discussions would be taken seriously, the SDGs could be a beginning and not this instrument that is blindly followed. So in some ways, I would say we should respond critically, but at the same time, try to see some of the interesting movements in that discussion. But maybe I'm naive.
Yes, I think Tiina has something to say there.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to shoot you down, but maybe being as naive or kind of realistic about the SDGs. I mean, of course, there is all these critics that we can have towards SDGs, but if you think about now, for example, Finnish universities, the whole idea of sustainable development or responsibilities to global south, or the kind of these global challenges, we're not very much on the agenda like 10 years ago. So I think that the SDGs have served their purpose in putting those things on the agenda. Of course, it is a different thing how we interpret them and how we actually use them. But I think the positive thing has been that now every university in Finland, for example, has been behind the UNIFIL Declaration of Sustainable Development and Global Responsibility, whatever lip service it can be, but it still opens the space for discussion and kind of the actual implementation of those things and the critical discussion between different disciplines also within the university. So I think that somehow they are enabling, and they enable also this critical discussion, because if they are kind of adopted, then we need to make an interpretation in our practical implementation.
I think all these 17 goals are noble goals. But then we have to ask the question, what's the telos? What's the ultimate goal of the SDGs? As I mentioned in my introduction, we are compelled to attain this goal within the global competitiveness agenda. Yeah. So what does I mean by that is that the goals for ecology, economy, and society are just being instrumentalized towards the completion of the global competitive world market. Yeah. So it is this instrumentalization that is problematic. Like, for instance, when they talk about climate change, climate change has to be addressed because it's not good for the world market. Inequalities, social inequalities and economic inequalities have to be addressed because it is a problem to economic growth. Why do you have to attain healthy individuals and educated, highly educated individuals? It's because they are good to be part of the so-called global proletariat, that can easily be expendable, indispensable, yeah, in and out of the labor market. So I don't have problems with the goals, but my problem is really the instrumentalization towards a problematic telos that they have, which is the world market. I think as development researchers, we have to go back to the goal of, we call it, human emancipation, you know, where human beings uh, would enjoy autonomy, um, and and uh, and getting back control of our own lives. Yeah, thanks.
Much fun. So we have more answers from the audience. Okay, the fourth question reads, according to media reports, there are significant disparities in the global south regarding the status quo of COVID-19 when compared to what aspects of societal development should researchers be concerned of in the global south? Barry, it seems your mic is.
Yeah, I want to say something about learning from the global south in a positive sense. If you compare, for example, I'm sitting here in Britain, we have a catastrophe, a disaster. It's been mismanaged from the start, and we have, far over 100,000 dead from COVID. 35 million people, supposedly, a place that shouldn't cope, 50% of the people apparently, the entire population of Kerala are deeply engaged regular basis on some sort of civil society social organization. And the government acted quickly and decisively, and they showed the strength of their society and of their approach to organizing themselves. And they're one of the best exemplars in the world of how to stop the pandemic. And you can name other countries, Vietnam and so on, who have done incredible jobs of stopping the pandemic in its tracks with very, very low rates of death. So, the arrogance of the North in many cases, and you can look at the United States, you can look at in Europe as a whole, I mean, disaster. And so something is fundamentally askew in who produces knowledge, who has the so-called best practices, who should be learning from whom. I mean, we should be learning from them. They don't have much to learn from us. If they followed our example, they would have a similar disaster. So we can focus a light on that to show that this old idea about the paternalism of the North and the South is always the 2T. They're always the one that's learning. They're always behind. This is nonsense. In so many cases, it's proven now in the pandemic, this is not so. In fact, or maybe even the contrary.
Thank you, Barry. Does someone have a comment? Bonn, yes, you have the visual floor.
No, in the Philippines, that was one of the first lessons I learned before, not to think that the West is the best all the time, and and that's a realization that we're having also in the global South, and yeah.
Yeah, I could say something a little bit about the not the global south, but more specific to sub-Saharan Africa, based on my field work. I mean, that's where I come from, and I mean, there has been this questions of why is there so much of a difference with the number of infected cases in perhaps Africa and then when compared to Europe as such, and I think thinking of what Tiina mentioned about the context about always thinking of the context, there is quite a lot of stigma associated with when talking about illnesses and infections as such. So not everybody opens up or is able to speak out of what they are infected with as such. And in that case, you might not have exactly the number of reported cases. And the same thing happens when it comes to the administrative aspect of vaccines. Not everybody shares the same belief of how effective the vaccines are, or if they should even go for it. So I think these are some of the things we should be thinking about when reflecting on the COVID situation. There is one comment from someone in the audience commented about the Sustainable Development Goals in the context of Finland, and it reads that yeah, the person looks at it in terms of inclusive and in terms of its inclusiveness, and that it's not really about not only about economic growth, but that different questions on how to define the sustainable development goals. But I think this is quite a similar thing with many other policy frameworks when they are designed, and it's always left for local governments on how they can apply it in the context of their nationalities and the context of the local level. Perhaps we go to the next question if we don't have another comment. In your view, would there be something the scholars in the North should learn from scholars, activists, communities in the South in the context of the COVID-19? I think Barry had commented on that, but did anybody have another comment on it?
I think one of the things maybe echoing Barry a little bit is that there is a lot of, we know a lot about the global South health activists and how they've been pushing the global North to understand that health is a political issue, and there are no biomedical or public health interventions that are not political. And this includes access to medication. And we know this from HIV, malaria, and Ebola, that there should be no separation of disciplines in the work against these things. And we can see it both in the kind of the everyday life understanding of immunity that is sometimes much more healthy in places that are not so biomedicalized in our way, so that hospitals in Italy can be much more dangerous places than villages in Sub-Saharan Africa because of the kind of more holistic understanding of immunity and how we develop that. So that kind of shifts the palette in a way, but then also we know if health is a political issue, we know that authoritarian regimes use those opportunities. So we know that in some places, like in the early stages of COVID restrictions in India or Brazil, South Africa, there have been lockdowns that are then used to establish political power. We know that from the US too. So these are not like the political issues around the world are often intertwined with health politics. And it's of course not enough to analyze them, but somehow I think it already is a good first step to be more aware of that, because we have a tendency of separating health from the rest of the political realm. And I think we've learned a lot during this year how societies and social scientists play a role. That's all.
Yeah.
Just one last further comment on that too, is that there's also a learning process where you in dialogue with a diverse range of groups, actors, organizations in the global South, you inquire how they have responded, what strategy have they used, what experience did they have, what organizational form did they use, and so on. what obstacles did they face? And you learn from that. That's part of the understanding of how people in the global south have been trying to cope with this crisis. And there's a lot to learn there if research focuses on that and listens to them.
And can I add one thing? Because I think it's important to learn from the HIV activists, because what they are suggesting is not either or. It's not like anti-vaccine, anti-biomedical pharmaceutical solutions, but trying to rethink both, so that there's a huge need for access to medication and vaccines around the world. So it's not like, hey, let's leave those Western interventions, but how could they be truly democratized? And how could we rethink some of the solutions we are always pushing so easily, but definitely not like, hey, leave us alone.
There's a comment in the chat box from Sabaheta. I'm not sure if that is a question, but it reads that it is better to have a concept or paradigm which sustained in its original meaning: gender, equality, decoloniality, conviviality, or be adopted by the global capitalist institutions that, as Bonn pointed out, just tend to be towards pursuing the ultimate goal, competitiveness and economic growth. Perhaps, Sava, would you want to say something more about this comment?
Hi. Yeah, it was a question, and it was it was a question. Is it better? Because I often also think about this, and I think one of the reasons why the growth hasn't made it yet up there, although it was now pointed out in one of the UN documents from the Global Assembly, UN Global Assembly. But anyway, I was referring to the discussion that Bonn had, and also I think Tiina making the point that it is still there is a value in bringing these issues up, no matter if they are a lip service. But often we see them, being co-opted and being losing the initial idea. So it was questioning to the panelists, what do you think is better?
Of course, what they are part of the resistance that they are saying is to create new vocabularies, and that's what the post-development colleagues that they are trying that now with the pluriverse, the coloniality, creating new vocabularies. But of course, the other issue is what you mentioned, how to communicate that with the policymakers and all.
It also goes the other way around, how to communicate that directly with the communities we're dealing with, or the society as a whole. I think that's what most within the discipline of anthropology, that's something which is really lies at the core of passing on the message.
But yeah, it also goes back to in addition to this, epistemological question, how are knowledge created? And this is about the learning process, There are two types of knowledges as we are taught, the so-called codified knowledge, which is just written, easily transferable, and the tacit knowledge, it's something embodied. It's difficult to transfer. And a lot of the good practices in response to the pandemic coming from the Global South come from the so-called tacit knowledges. Yeah. So, and you learn that through interaction. It's still difficult to translate those things into words. And I think we have to, as development researchers, we have to come up with a database about these tacit knowledges, the different practices that have been done effectively in the Global South. But of course, we should not romanticize the Global South response at the moment. Like, for instance, Tanzania, 0 cases, but there are no reports going on in there. And then in the, with my Vietnamese friends here living in Finland, they're skeptical because they are still thinking that there are some silences happening, at the political regime level. So we still don't know. I think what, as development researchers, we also have to 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 um, to be humble, as what Elina mentioned, that there are, because there's always this pressure, to publish and write something. But we are also trained to have longitudinal, a long-term perspective. We have to see how all these processes unfold, so that we would realize the causes and effects of of phenomena. So I think there are many things that are still too early to tell, and we should be very mindful about that. And as trained academics, we have to be careful about making conclusions.
Thank you, Bonn.
I've got a comment on this for Sabahita's question. Is that, of course, it's well known and established that you might say mainstreaming by major institutions and organizations of the world order, you can name a list of them, that co-optation, and as Bonn said, instrumentalization of what were originally critiques or new ideas or radical ideas it's endemic and constant and reiterative. It just happens and happens and happens, So that's why I would just want to emphasize to people, that this is the time of all times to be bold enough to keep pressing on the creation of the alternative narratives, the alternative concepts, the alternative paradigms, the alternative practices. This is more like our role. At least it is for me as a critical scholar. Yes, I want to resist the co-optations that the mainstream system makes, which also disarms and distorts the meanings of what were actually more radical concepts. That needs to be opposed and exposed and so on. So, I don't think it's like an either or, is one better than the other. They both exist, but I'm just emphasizing to people to have the courage of their own convictions, especially right now in history. And I mean this very seriously, push the alternatives as much as possible.
Okay,
Yes,
can I continue? To that same question, I think that what Barry said is really relevant, and of course we always can also question what was in the question, that the concept in this very original meaning. Of course, we also know that concepts are evolving and they have this kind of negotiated nature. But what we have observed already, the sustainable development and the decolonizing has been already instrumentalized, or kind of putting in the use of competition between different disciplines. You can see that there are so many initiatives of decolonize this and that already. So I think that, but in the very practical terms, we cannot. I'm afraid we cannot kind of hinder the instrumentalization or co-optation of these concepts, but we need to be very clear that in every negotiation situation we are in, within our universities, within the policies, within our research community, we are ready to challenge and to kind of question, okay, what do you actually mean by that, and how do you come to that, and what are the implications, and so on and so forth, in order to have this kind of pockets of resistance. And that's why I somehow still stick to my kind of positive thinking, that it is somehow also positive that these concepts are co-opted if we continue to remember to critique and to kind of resist the kind of instrumental use of the concept.
Thank you, Tiina. We have a question from Eva. What steps can we take to strengthen monetization of development research? How can we better collaborate with other actors, other sciences, businesses, NGOs in terms of funding? Would Elina have a say on this? Or?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to have these two discussions after another. So how to better work with businesses, and then the earlier about kind of, in some ways, purity of mind. I think we we shouldn't be a we in a way. We should, as academics, we should accept and maybe even nourish very different ways of working and very different politics amongst us. So, because in a way, my feminist analytical lens says that there's always been quite different ways of doing alternative scholarship and trying to change the world. And some of us are using the same vocabulary with the businesses and maybe doing some interesting changes there. Others are vocally very radical, but their ways of or possibilities of changing the existing policies are therefore hampered. So we don't have to agree on what the best politics would be, and that actually would be very dangerous for the scholarly diversity. It's dangerous if a field agrees too much. So let's disagree, but let's be skeptical to each other and also call each other out when we notice that this is too uncle, patriarchal, whatever, or somehow too co-opted to this and that. So more fights, I would say, but in a kind of gentle agreement that we should still respect the alternative paths. How to get more money? I think we really do need to know that development studies is so underfunded in the Nordic realm, for example. There's so little money, and also there's so little awareness, understanding, and capacity in the other disciplines neighboring to ours to do the work we do. So we are like minimal and weak, and there should be more noise around this. There's now, for example, a huge effort to make the Finnish education system globally relevant and have an enormous export push. And there, I think development studies perspectives would be hugely needed. So there's reason to make us more visible. How? Every effort is good. Anything goes, but let's scream. That's it.
Thank you. Yes, Bonn, please.
Yeah, for me, I go back to the question of distribution. How do we distribute scarce resources among colleagues? And I think, again, I problematize this competitiveness, but we are going against the structural now. I mean, we have actually created too much researchers than needed, but somehow I think it's also part of the system that we have created a surplus population among researchers, and that also justifies the proletarianization of academics. To be easily put in and out of the labor market, and that's really very structural. And I think I believe that as academics, we have the ideas and the capacity to re-examine the kind of structures that have been imposed on us, and also the relationship that we have. And as I mentioned, let's find ways how we could be much more convivial, in mutual aid, rather than to think about competition, but because we are better together rather than in competition with one another.
Thank you very much, Bonn. We are already over exactly on time. I want to thank you all for the participation, and I might not have been able to deal with all the comments, but there's a lot of more issues in the chat box about the situation in Myanmar, and those who are interested in research about the vaccines, and those who are also interested to know about EXO, you can check all of that in the chat box. And I think I would then pass the virtual floor to Chris. Chris, now you have the floor, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ayonghe. And also, of course, thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Elina and Tiina and Bonn and Barry. This has been such a fantastic discussion.